true stories
that make us say,
wow, God.
Wow, God.
Wow, God.
I just continued to just weep and cry for just months on end.
I found myself in a really deep and debilitating depression. It was like my body was alive, but there was no life within me.
My wife remembers me leaving the angry person and me coming back to school on Monday completely different. And what it was Jesus just coming to live in my life. It was just absolutely life-changing for me.
Hi, I'm Rob Vischer. I recently watched Inside Out with my 6-year-old and 4-year-old daughters. If you don't know what Inside Out is, you're probably not a girl dad. Pixar's Inside Out is an animated film that personifies each individual's emotions as 5 brightly colored mini Muppets who all run the control panel inside our minds. There's bright yellow sing-songy joy.
I'm joy.
The blue, slow-moving sadness.
This is sadness.
The purple, nervous fear.
That's fear. He's really good at keeping Riley safe.
And the red and often fiery anger.
That's anger. He cares very deeply about things being fair.
So that's how you want to play it, old man? No dessert?
And the green, semi-stuck-up disgust.
She basically keeps Riley from being poisoned.
The headquarters in which they all operate is a great pun. And in the movie, it's designed in a way that combines the look of the bridge from Star Trek with the aesthetic of a brightly colored bowling alley designed by perhaps Apple. Emotions are real. And although I'm not claiming emotions are actual characters running around in our head, God gave them to us for a reason. And our first guest, Nigel, shows us how even the blue, slow-moving sadness dragged him closer to God.
I'm Nigel Masenda. I'm Zimbabwean and grew up in the traditional Zimbabwean home. And what that means is most of the women are quite emotive and they're just very demonstrative of their love. But the men tend to be more stoic and reserved, so they're not really emotive or providing love in that way. But for me, I was very emotive. Like I very much desired that and needed that. And so my mom always provided that for me. But whenever I was 8 years old, my grandfather, he unfortunately and unexpectedly passed away. And my mom went back to Zimbabwe for the funeral, but the rest of the family, we stayed. This was supposed to be a 2-week trip, but it ended up being a 2-year period. The reason that the delay happened is because there were some geopolitical issues taking place in Zimbabwe that effectively barred her from coming back home. After a month at 8 years old without your mom, you just quickly began to shift gears a little bit. And now I'm just angry with the Lord and saying, God, like, why aren't you bringing my mother home? So I then quickly pivoted to just anger and frustration, which lasts another couple of weeks. So now we're about 6 weeks in, and still there's no clarity and certainty, which I think was one of the most difficult parts throughout the 2 years is you don't know when it's going to end. There's no end date in sight. And at 8 years old, at this point, it just kind of feels like this is inevitable. So at about 6 weeks, 7 weeks after anger, I just resigned to, okay, Lord, this is just what the reality of the situation is. And what's scary is this is around the time that just a spirit of depression just hit me and just set in. And in some respect, I kind of accepted it. I just resigned to the reality of, okay, like this is just what my life looks like now. Like my mom's gone and she's not coming back. But the Lord kept me throughout this time. Like though I gave up in one respect, on the other hand, I continue to pray in just a real guttural way, just like travailing in many ways. Like there was no words. I would just pray and just cry. I would just be crying and weeping and going on these prayer walks, but there's an absence of words. And looking back at it, it just was like revealing to me of how God is able to keep us and hold us, and he is hearing me. I don't need to speak to know that God hears me and he's able to provide and nurture and care for me in these moments and at this time. So I just continued to just weep and cry for just months on end. There was a point, I want to say at like the 3-month mark, where the depression really set in. I just became very insular. Every day was so rough. I literally would try to minimize the amount of time that I was awake. So I would go to sleep really early, like at 9 p.m. And then if I could, I would just wake up at like 8 a.m. just in time to go to school. So literally, it would just be sitting in silence with the Lord, like a lot of times, just holding that tension. But what was unique to me is looking back at it, there was periods of time where the Lord was just providing for me in unique ways that I wasn't appreciating it. When I was going on my prayer walks, I was like just weeping, crying, walking up and down the streets. And turns out one of my classmates lived on one of the main street that I was walking up and down, praying and crying. During that summer, he and I became incredibly close, like literally best friends. And every weekend I would go over to their house. I shifted from waking up at 8 a.m. to waking up at 6 a.m. just to go over and hang out with my friend Nick. And their dad was just so sweet. So he left the garage door open for me, and I would just roll in the garage door at 6 a.m. on Saturdays and like knock on the door, like, is Nick home? So every weekend I would spend the entire weekend with the Deans. Like that's what I was doing on the weekends. Perry, their dad, he would just take Nick and I on his excursions on the weekends, just really giving me the experience that I needed at the time that I didn't even know I needed. I knew that there was an absence of this love, but I didn't know how it was going to come. I thought it could only come through my mother. But looking back, the Lord was providing for my needs in this real visceral and intentional way. He brought this family into my life. And then, of course, on the other side of the street was another family, the Paramores. They had a son, Johnny, we're the same age. And around the same time, too, they brought me in. And they would invite me to like their family trips. And I was the only friend that would get invited to these trips, both with the Paramores and with the Deans. And it's interesting because I did not know their sons super well by the time the invitations were coming. And they would bring me and I would spend the night at their house. I wasn't explicitly saying like, hey, my mom's not here. Can you help me? It was genuinely just like the Lord's providence, like his goodness. All in the background, I'm still praying and I'm still in deep depression, right? And that's the thing, is I'm still in deep depression. So these are just moments of time that are happening. I'm going back home. I am depressed. Leaving the Deans, leaving the Paramores, going home, I am depressed. But the Lord is just providing and also just revealing how proximal he is and how much he cares about the things that I care about. And also how much like the way in which he provides is not contingent on the works that I do. Like he loves me because he's chosen me. Me rebelling and me just like being as erratic 8, 9, 10-year-old did not negate his love for me. Like he did not bring my mother home after 2 years because I prayed the right way. He did not sustain me in the 2 years because I just surrendered to him in the right way. Like he did that because God is good and he loves me and he has chosen me. Like I am his son. And when I weep, he weeps. And he wants good things for me. So like for me, it just revealed so much of who he is in that season.
Just like in the movie Inside Out, Nigel's sadness eventually turned into joy. But our next guest, Derwin, unknowingly masked his sadness and his fear with success.
Playing in the NFL is like, okay, that's what it means to be a man, right? So just because you're good at something on a football field doesn't mean you're good at being a man off the field. So for me, being an NFL player, I was responsible, I was intentional, I was passionate, I was studied, I was ready to be an NFL player. I was a much better NFL player than I was a man. Outside of the field, I was what I like to call emotionally constipated. I suppressed emotions. I wasn't able to communicate with my wife. I wasn't able to communicate my feelings. I was passive. The only thing I was aggressive about was actually playing the game, right? So my journey into manhood took place when I met Christ. So I didn't grow up in church. Football was in essence, was my God. And so in Texas, that's just what we do. Played at a great high school. I had great coaches. I learned discipline. I learned sacrifice. I learned teamwork. I learned a lot of incredible things about manhood, became a great player, got a football scholarship, ended up meeting my wife my freshman year, and everything's going great for us. Football's a great God until you can't make it happy anymore. My rookie year, I get drafted by the Colts in 93. I wasn't playing much. 94, I'm playing better. 95, I'm a team captain. I'm on top of the world. But it was at that moment when I realized there's got to be more. So despite my NFL status, despite my investment portfolio, I can't love my wife the way she deserves to be loved because I can't love myself. I can't forgive my father who was not involved in my life. I couldn't forgive things that happened to me. I couldn't forgive myself for stuff that I had done. Also, I knew this, the NFL stands for not for long. So what would I do? Who would I be when I didn't play anymore? And those thoughts haunted me. I had an existential crisis at 25. Then the next year I started getting injuries. But I had a teammate with the Colts that for 5 years, he would share Christ with me, and his methodology was a little different. I share the story in my book, Lit Up with Love, but his nickname was the Naked Preacher. His real name was Steve Grant, but dude would literally take a shower hour after practice, dry off, wrap a towel around his waist, and ask my teammates, do you know Jesus? And I asked the veterans on the team, what's up with the half-naked black man walking around naked, right? So, but one day he asked me a question that changed my life. He said, do you know Jesus? And like most people who don't know the saving work of Jesus, I gave him my resume. Hey, I don't do this. I don't do this. I haven't done this. I haven't done this. So basically, I was judging my goodness by putting other people down, which is sin. And so he just gently said, so our comparison ain't with other people. It's actually with the glory of God, and the glory of God is Jesus. And I said, what? And he goes, yeah. He goes, what you do and what I do can never be good enough to reach God. But because God is loving, he becomes good enough for us in Jesus. And Jesus died on the cross for our sins, and he rose again to now live in us and give us purpose and power in his kingdom. So I was a little hard-headed. That took multiple years for that to take root. But August 2nd, 1997, in a small dorm room in Anderson, Indiana, my 5th year in NFL training camp with the Colts, went back to my dorm room after lunch, and I called my wife and I said, I want to be more committed to you, and I want to be committed to Jesus. And that's when I was reborn. That's when I was made spiritually alive. That's when I was forgiven of sins. That's when Jesus invaded and occupied my life. That's when Jesus made me his own. And that began my journey towards manhood, right? And so God brought some incredible mentors into my life. A gentleman by the name of Alan Bacon. He mentored me in the word, but he mentored me in manhood. I saw how he loved his wife. I saw how he parented his kids. I saw how consistent he was at work. And so he was teaching me through our relationship. That began my journey to manhood. And neither my wife nor I grew up in church. And so we threw ourselves into the Bible, into the gospel. We started studying marriage. We started studying what does it mean to be a husband and a wife.
Derwin suppressed his feelings with success until he had a midlife crisis at 25. But in our next story, Walter doesn't even try to suppress his anger at God. He lives in it and even revels in it.
My name's Walter Hill, and I have an interesting story, I believe, of walking with Jesus through a life that's had a lot of ups and downs in it, but finding him at a time when things were really dark and really bleak. I grew up in the desert Southwest. My father was a miner, my mom was a banker, and she was the only one that had faith. She was the only Christian in the house, and we had watched her come to faith at a Baptist church. My father didn't share it. He wasn't very happy about it, but he let her come and go from church, and that was all we had really heard about. When I was 14 years old, my mom began to have a lot of pain in her back, and through process of taking tests and all the medical things that go on, we were informed that she had cancer in her pancreas. We were told that she had 6 months to live. We watched her fight for 6 weeks is all, and then pass away. The thing that was so challenging for me at that point was I had no knowledge of my mom's faith, But I saw her relying on it, and I saw her Christian friends standing around the bed praying and doing all the things that Christians do. And I was standing in the corner watching all of this. And so, probably fairly predictably, I just wound up angry. God, if you're real, then the only person in the house that was believing you was her. She was the best person in the house, and now she's dead. While I was processing that and just trying to figure out what does that even look like, the ministry team of her church tried to comfort me, and I had questions. If I wasn't willing to just sit and nod and listen and accept what they were saying, then they just didn't really want to spend any time with me. So then they weren't there to answer any of the questions. I turned to my father, and that's when the other shoe dropped, if you want to say. My father had many life issues that were not great that my mother had basically kept in check while we were kids. So we were not aware that my father was an alcoholic. So with her being gone, I come home trying to figure things out to find my father drunk at the house, which was something I had never seen before. And we entered into that world of me figuring out that, okay, not only are you not really here for me, you're not actually even here for you. At 15, with mom gone, basically all of a sudden dad is gone too, even though he's in the house with me. And her church people hadn't given me any answers. So I really found myself in a very, very dark, spirally kind of place, really angry. I was definitely that quote unquote troubled teen that nobody really would have wanted in their youth groups or in their gatherings. I was just very angry, very bitter. But along the trail, I had one Christian friend. I had known him since we were in second grade together. And he just kept inviting me to his church and his youth group. And I can say sometimes I said no nicely, and other times I was absolutely horrible to him out of how angry I was. But he just hung in. He just kept smiling. He knew my mom, and he would say, man, your mom was great. I know it sucks that she's gone, but why don't you come to youth group, or why don't you come to church? I told him no over and over and over again. He's a real testimony to the power of just persistence. If you care about somebody, you just keep loving them and you just keep inviting them to the table. One day I told him yes, and I still don't actually know why. I just found myself saying, okay, fine, what time and where does it meet? And when the words came out of my mouth, I couldn't really even believe it. I thought, well, man, he just worn me down, I guess. So I went to a little youth group way long ago, before churches were cool like they are now. So this was just a handful of kids and some folding metal chairs in a little upstairs room in a rundown building with a nice couple trying to have a youth group. But I found there a love and a willingness to answer my questions that I had not encountered anywhere before. The youth leaders, later on, we became very close. They told me, you were one of the angriest kids we had ever seen. But because they were willing to love and because they were willing to listen, which maybe is another good takeaway for people that are listening to this story, I went with them to a youth outreach event. And a young man was standing up front and he's preaching the gospel. I had no real point of reference for that, but I was sitting there and I was listening to it. But all of a sudden, it really was like he was just talking to me. The sense that I had was so personal and it was so compelling because it was like his words were just literally landing in my own heart. But I was sitting in a room that probably had 300 other teenagers in it. But he got to the end of his planned message and he stopped and he said, I feel like I have to say this. And he said, there's somebody here and you're angry with God. And he took about 2 minutes and he basically told my story from the platform in a way that there was no way for him to know. It was just absolutely shocking. I had no idea what was happening, but it was obvious that it was God reaching out to me and calling me. I wound up coming to Christ that night. And what I found in Jesus when I accepted him was so life transforming for me, because I was amazed that a God I was angry at wanted me. My father had been my only picture of what God sort of might be like in my life. And he had made it very clear, if you're doing well, I want you around. If you're not doing well, I really don't want to be bothered with you. So it surprised me so much to have this overwhelming sense that a God I was angry with was saying, no, I want you to come home to me. That was really just a mind-blowing experience for me. And when I opened my heart to Christ, the relief that came, the joy that just flooded into my heart, it was so tangible. I was so blown away by how much love and life and joy and peace came flooding into my life. I'm presently married to my wife of 35 years. We have an interesting story because she knew me then. We weren't dating, but we had a class together in the last year of high school. And she still to this day remembers me leaving on the Friday, the angry person, and me coming back to school on Monday, in her words, completely different, with just a light that I had inside. That's her words. And what it was Jesus just coming to live in my life. And it was just absolutely life-changing for me. And so from that point onward, I often reference that God has a sense of humor, because he takes the angry kid who was so upset with him and winds up calling me into ministry. I've done time as a youth pastor. I got my chance to be the one sitting with the angry kid and remembering grace and remembering and being able to extend that grace to another troubled young person. Several hundred of them, of people like that along the way. I've had 25 years now of being a lead pastor. It still blows my mind that God would do that with somebody that the beginning was I was just angry with him. And now in this last season of my life that I'm in right now, it's even come more full circle, because during the week, I'm actually a hospice chaplain in my city. And so I am now standing, giving the comfort and sharing Christ with the people who are fighting the cancer. And my story begins at watching my mom die of cancer. So even the redemption of that, I think, is just fascinating, how God weaves and works his stories out. God knows how to get the most out of the pains that we have. And most times when we go through something really hard, we go, what is the point of this? And there's a little passage in the Bible where it says eventually you end up comforting other people with the comfort that you received in Christ. And so anybody going through anything difficult, that part of your story he can use to weave into and change another person's story. And he never wastes a hurt, and he never wastes a pain. And so I just am amazed at God's goodness and his grace and his mercy. And that's my story of finding Christ and finding joy in Christ, and then walking through a life where sometimes that joy is taken a beating, but he has always shown me the paths back to connecting to that beginning, that first moment of meeting him, and that refuels my joy over and over. And we've had a long walk together, and I intend to walk with him all the way to the very end. So that's my story.
God loved Walt in the middle of his anger. But in our next story, David gets to know a husband who thought divorce seemed like a better option than communicating with his wife when she was angry.
I remember several years ago, this young couple who had gotten engaged to be married showed up in our small church. Their name is Mark and Caitlin, and they were looking for someone to do their wedding. And I was happy to do it. In fact, we had started a young couples group, kind of a mentoring group for young couples in their first couple years of marriage, just to help with some of the emotional intelligence and take the sting out of those, what can be difficult first couple years. And they got married in October, and we went through a year together as an extended premarital, but it was part of this couples mentoring. And they really connected with the community. But it was a year and a half later, I stopped seeing them as much, and it got back to me. They had separated, and I was surprised, but I was also heartbroken. I felt really invested in them. And when the wheels started coming off, they didn't even know how to reach out for help. And what was really interesting was my wife was running the trail here in Austin, and she ran into him. and said, "Oh, Mark, we haven't seen you around," and got an idea of the story. And then I was at a restaurant within the next week and I ran into him again. I said, "We need to have him over." And we got to hear the whole story. Caitlin was raised in a home where anything goes. She had a sister and a mom, and they could say anything. They could hang up on each other, call each other every name in the book, but they knew they were always going to be sisters or siblings or daughters. But there was no filter, very emotional. Mark grew up in a home that was very cerebral, very cognitive. He didn't know how to express a lot of emotion. And so he began to describe, he says, we would get to Friday night and we couldn't even decide where to eat without it becoming an argument. And then she started having ideas about wanting to get a home and start a family. And I just didn't know what to do. It would be like communicating on two frequencies of AM and FM. I didn't mean it, but I just threw out the D word. I thought, wow, how do we move forward? And out it came. He said divorce, and being reactionary, that was all she needed to hear. And she took off. And 90 days later, by the state of Texas, they were divorced. And so I remember calling her up in Dallas. She had moved in with her old college roommate, and it was like just a bomb had gone off. I started meeting with Mark monthly. He was traveling for work, but one thing led to another, and our meetings became twice a month and 3 times a month. And he had so much, I kept drawing it back to faith. And he's, I want to talk about faith, but this is really about my marriage. I said, okay. I remember sitting with him one day at lunch, and he expressed the desire that he wants to pursue Caitlin about reconciling. And I thought, I'm here with you for the journey, but good luck. You've got my prayers. Well, he made himself available for a week, and she did not respond. It felt like that ship has sailed. There's too much hurt. Neither one of them had had an affair. There was no other interest. It's just they had a breakdown in communication. Somewhere along the line, I get a text of Mark just describing this God that he knew but didn't know. I wasn't sure what he was asking about, but we met in my office that day where he begins talking about a God that he knew on a cognitive level, but a God that he had never met on a relational level. And in the office, with tears, he began to invite Christ to take over his life, to take up residency. I like to use the language of citizenship, where we pledge our allegiance. We come under the lordship, the banner of Christ, and we have these new affections. And that's what Mark began to do. It was not too long after that he was traveling and got word that Caitlin was interested in talking, and they met up. That meetup turned into an 8-hour conversation that turned into several days of clarifying what was meant and asking for forgiveness. And that turned into about 9 months of courtship, rebuilding trust, relearning how to communicate with Christ in their lives, and then trying to help all of their friends and their family who have taken up offenses and felt their pain reawaken to the idea of them being a couple again. And on February 14th, I was invited to do their wedding a second time, almost 4 years after their first marriage. I remember beginning, and it was just about 12 of us, moms, dads, brothers and sisters. And I just said, in the words of Scott Peck, welcome to the road less traveled. We live in a day and age where relationships are largely disposable. We would rather move on than do the hard work of reconciling. But you two, through God's grace, have been able to restore what was once good and can be redeemed. And today they are thriving. They've been together. They have 2 children, and they have such a strong marriage that feels more like a testimony of who God is when we surrender our lives to his leading and to his lordship.
When everything centered around Caitlin's anger and Mark's disgust at Caitlin's anger, their marriage remained broken. After Mark and Caitlin centered their marriage around Jesus, God brought healing to their marriage and to their emotions. It sounds too simple, And maybe that's because we heard their story in 6 minutes. For them, their story has played out over years of prayer and restoration. In our next story, Allie experiences severe trauma, and instead of working through her emotions with Jesus, she tries to bury them, and in the process is almost buried by them.
My name is Allie Marie Smith. As a little girl, I loved sports. I was constantly climbing trees and playing soccer, and I was really feisty and confident as a little girl and was always with my dog Sunny and having adventures. Around the age of 12, I started to experience these feelings of sadness, of loneliness, shame, and unworthiness, and it didn't make sense. I had every reason to be happy. On the outside, it looked like I was the girl who had it together, captain of the soccer team, straight-A student, part of the popular crowd. I had always loved God and believed in God, but I didn't know I could have this personal, intimate relationship with Him. And when I was 17, something very traumatic happened to me, and I never told anyone. 2 weeks after I graduated high school, I found myself in a really deep and debilitating depression. I couldn't eat and I couldn't sleep. I couldn't talk. It was like my body was alive, but there was no life within me. My parents had me admitted to the psychiatric hospital, and I believed the lie that the world was better off without me in it. I was sent home, put on antidepressants after I promised the doctor I wouldn't hurt myself. And one day on a gloomy June morning, I grabbed my car keys and I drove to the Golden Gate Bridge with the intention to end my life by jumping off. I was getting closer to the bridge. I was driving somewhat recklessly, and my tire hit a curb. I got a flat tire, and suddenly this kind-hearted, silver-haired man came and asked if he could help me and call for roadside assistance. I strangely engaged in a real conversation with that man, and it gave me some hope in my heart. After my tire was fixed, I went home to my family. My parents were told by doctors that it would be good for me to start college 3,000 miles away on the East Coast, but I had entered into a really even scarier place, and my dad came and I was readmitted to the psychiatric hospital that fall in September, my freshman year. I had never really read the Bible before, but I was so desperate for hope, I asked for a copy. As I began to read the Gospels for myself, I met Jesus in a very supernatural way. And as I read about him and his love, I saw that he loved the broken and he came to give them hope and healing and belonging. It was there that I discovered my true value simply came from being a child of God. And one day we were taken to the hospital chapel, and as a woman sang Amazing Grace, I was overwhelmed by the perfect love of Jesus that just filled me with hope. And I surrendered my life to Jesus, and I said I was going to stop living for myself and I was going to start living for God. I was forever changed by the love of Christ. I thought that once I came to God, he would take all my problems away. And God saved my life again through one day hitting really rock bottom again. And he spared my life, and he has restored me. Shortly after my first hospitalization, it was clear that God had given me a heart to help other girls and women know God and their value and their worth and about the beautiful purpose God has for their lives. And I came across Psalm 139 one day, and the verse it says, I praise you because I am fearfully, meaning lovingly and wonderfully made. And I knew right in that moment, I was supposed to start some movement or ministry called Wonderfully Made to share the love of God with other girls and women. And since then, we have become a national ministry with the honor of being able to serve millions of girls and women through our podcast, our resources, our events and my book, Wonderfully Made, Discover the Identity, Love, and Worth You Were Created For, we have seen the tremendous rise in mental health issues such as anxiety and depression. We have a lot of parents and moms writing in about how their daughters are struggling, the sadness and the darkness so many girls are experiencing, and being able to share my story of hope that they can get through what I went through, and been able to pour into one young woman. She is 12 years old and she's from the most beautiful family, and she's talented and smart and well-loved and liked, but she is believing so many lies and thoughts that she's not good enough or thoughts that she shouldn't be here. I've been able to help her identify the lies she's believing. And one day, as we wrote all those lies out, we were able to write the truth at each single one. It's just been beautiful to see that God has used what I have gone through to speak truth, that there's hope and that there is healing possible for them.
Allie discovered that she's wonderfully made, and she helps others discover the same thing. And part of the wonder in Wonderfully is the ability to experience God-given emotions. Not only the deep underlying joy that God can give, but the sadness I feel when I experience brokenness in the world. The anger I feel when I see injustice, and the fear I feel when I know something is way too big for me to handle on my own. And I pray that as a girl dad, I'll be able to keep that sense of awe and wonder about emotions as my girls grow into teenagers. And although I don't talk to my emotions or my girls' emotions like they're actually brightly colored mini Muppets in our heads, I do recognize they're given to us as a gift by God. And that makes me say, wow, God. And when I say wow, God, I mean the one true living God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's the one who makes my heart say,
wow, God.
Wow, God.
Wow, God.
My wow God story.
I wanted to share a wow God moment.
That's my wow God story. Praise God.
And I'm so thankful to God for this wow God moment.
So, thank you, God.